It began like the kind of love story people dream of, two souls who seemed meant to find each other in the chaos of modern life. In 2005, Diana Lovejoy and Greg Mulvihill met on an online dating site. Both were professionals in San Diego. They had steady careers, and they were far from their families. That distance, that quiet ache for connection, drew them closer than either expected. What started as friendly messages soon turned into long drives up the coast, hiking trails at sunset, and weekend adventures through the California hills. They bonded over their shared love of the outdoors. The smell of pine after rain, the rush of wind at the top of a trail, the challenge of pushing themselves to the edge. Diana, especially, was the kind of person who seemed built for motion. Athletic, disciplined, driven. She'd spent her youth competing in sports and, as an adult, became a triathlete. Fitness wasn't just something she did. It was who she was. To Greg, her energy was magnetic. She made life feel lighter, full of purpose. Their connection deepened quickly. Within 2 years, they stood together under the warm sun, saying "I do" in 2007. Their honeymoon in Costa Rica was pure euphoria. Surf lessons, laughter, and the thrill of starting a new life together. For Diana, it was everything she'd ever dreamed of. The marriage, the house, the life she'd earned through years of dedication. When they returned to California, they settled in Carlsbad, a beautiful suburb north of San Diego. The community was calm, safe, and lined with scenic trails and lagoons. Diana would later call it her dream home. She felt that everything was finally perfect, the kind of happily ever after that looks effortless from the outside. But fairy tales, even the ones that begin with real love, can fracture slowly, sometimes so quietly, no one hears the first crack. At first, their marriage was blissful. Friends would later describe the couple as inseparable, the type of pair that made others believe in love again. They'd spend mornings running along the coast, afternoons kayaking, and evenings cooking together at home. Greg was calm, patient, and kind, the kind of man who always tried to understand before reacting. But around 2010, Diana's health began to change. The woman who once thrived on motion started waking up in pain. Doctors ran tests but found little explanation. Eventually, she was told she might be suffering from fibromyalgia, a chronic condition marked by constant pain, fatigue, and sensitivity. It was devastating news for someone whose life revolved around activity. For Diana, rest felt like defeat. But rest was all she could do. Her energy faded. Her motivation dimmed. Work became difficult. Training stopped entirely. For a woman who once measured her life in miles and medals, her world began to shrink to the walls of her home. Greg tried to help. He encouraged her to slow down, to see more specialists, to take time off, but the changes were hard on both of them. Diana was no longer the vibrant athlete he married. She was exhausted, angry, and frustrated. Their once effortless connection began to strain under the weight of illness and uncertainty. Still, Greg loved her deeply. He planned a trip to Santa Cruz in 2011, hoping the ocean air might help her heal. Friends later recalled how devoted he was. Always patient, always caring. But sometimes love, no matter how genuine, isn't enough to quiet the storms building inside someone's mind. Over time, Diana's focus shifted from fitness to something else, something she'd always longed for but could never quite reach. She wanted to be a mother. For years, she and Greg tried. And for years, she miscarried. Each loss was a fresh wound. Friends said she became consumed with grief, spiraling between hope and despair. When her beloved cat died during that period, Greg tried to comfort her the best he could, even bringing home a kitten to help ease her sadness. But nothing filled the void she carried. Then, in 2012, everything changed. After countless failed attempts, Diana discovered she was finally pregnant. It was the miracle she'd been waiting for. Greg was ecstatic. He took time off work when their baby boy was born that September, wanting to be there for every moment, the feedings, the laughter, the first sounds of life that filled their once quiet home. For a while, things felt whole again, but soon, Diana's anxiety took over. She began to believe their son might be sick, that he could inherit some mysterious illness like hers. Greg insisted the baby was healthy, but Diana wouldn't accept it. She started researching obscure medical theories online and convinced herself that a drug called guaifenesin could somehow cure fibromyalgia-like symptoms. Greg pleaded with her not to give it to their son, calling it dangerous. Their disagreements turned into arguments, quiet ones at first, then louder, more frequent, until the love that once defined their marriage began to erode. As Diana's health continued to falter, Greg injured his shoulder and had to leave his job. The financial strain only added to the tension. With both of them home, struggling and frustrated, their once loving home became a battlefield. Diana started taking on odd jobs, even trying to make cooking videos online to help bring in income. But nothing worked. By the time their son turned 2, their marriage was unraveling. It was around this time that Diana began telling coworkers and friends that Greg was controlling, that he didn't support her or understand her pain. Then, in 2014, she filed a police report claiming Greg had assaulted her while she was sleeping. According to her story, the medication she'd been taking made her drowsy, and she woke to find Greg touching her without consent. She went further, accusing him of abusing their son. The accusations stunned everyone. Greg denied everything. Friends described him as gentle, incapable of violence. But in the world of family court and custody battles, even unproven claims can have devastating effects. Child Protective Services got involved. Investigators ordered psychological evaluations for both Greg and his son. For months, Greg lived under suspicion, separated from his home, his wife, and the child he loved more than anything. But eventually, the truth began to surface. The evaluations found no evidence of abuse. Police found nothing to support Diana's claims. The case was dropped. Greg was cleared and granted 50-50 custody of their son. For most people, that would have been the end of it. But for Diana, it was just the beginning of something darker. She couldn't stand the idea of sharing her son. The woman who once built her life around control, diet, fitness, discipline, now found herself losing control of everything: her marriage, her finances, even her motherhood. And somewhere in that loss, something inside her shifted. By 2016, Diana and Greg's divorce had become final. On paper, it seemed they'd reached peace. Diana would stay in the house and pay Greg $120,000 for his share. They had an amicable custody schedule. Greg had moved on and was trying to rebuild. But beneath that calm surface, Diana was harboring resentment. She complained to friends that Greg was still harassing her, that he was manipulative, that she feared for her safety. According to prosecutors, this was the stage when Diana began reaching out to people for help. Not the kind of help that comes from therapy or friends, but the kind that carries the echo of violence. If you're finding this story as interesting as we did, take a moment to subscribe to this channel. Each week, we uncover the real stories behind the headlines. It was the night of September 1st, 2016, when everything changed. That evening, Greg received a strange phone call. The voice on the other end claimed to be a private investigator, saying he had important documents that could help Greg in his custody battle with Diana. The man gave him a time and a place to meet, a secluded dirt road near Carlsbad. Greg was cautious. The call didn't sit right with him, but curiosity, and maybe a bit of desperation, made him agree. Still, he wasn't reckless. He called his friend, Jason Kovacs, and asked him to come along, just in case. The two men drove out together, armed only with a flashlight and a child's baseball bat, a small gesture of protection that would later prove painfully naive. The road was pitch black. No moonlight, no street lamps, just the soft hum of crickets and the crunch of gravel under their tires. Greg parked the car and stepped out, his flashlight slicing through the dark. Somewhere up ahead, near an electrical pole, he saw a small object. Maybe a bag, maybe an envelope. He moved closer, sweeping the light side to side. Jason waited near the car, uneasy. He could barely see Greg's silhouette against the darkness. Then, a voice. A whisper of panic. "Gun!" A shot rang out. Then another. Jason dropped to the ground as bullets tore through the night. He heard Greg scream, heard him stumble, and ran toward the car. When Greg finally reached him, he was bleeding. A gunshot wound to the chest. Jason threw himself into the driver's seat, fumbling for his phone, calling 911 as his friend struggled to breathe beside him. Within minutes, police and SWAT units flooded the area. The shooter was gone. Greg was rushed to the hospital, barely clinging to life. While doctors fought to save him, detectives scoured the scene. They found an Angry Birds towel neatly folded near the pole. Maybe bait, maybe a marker. They also found something else. A pile of human waste next to another towel, as if someone had been lying in wait for hours. too afraid to leave the spot. Investigators collected everything for DNA testing. But lab results would take weeks. For now, they had no suspect, no motive. Only one man's blood on the ground and a haunting question hanging over the quiet streets of Carlsbad. Who wanted Greg Mulvihill dead? Days passed. Greg survived surgery and was placed on life support. When he woke, detectives were there waiting. They asked him if he could think of anyone who'd want to hurt him. He hesitated, then said softly, "No, but maybe you should talk to my ex-wife." Even then, Greg didn't believe Diana could be capable of something like that. He told them about their divorce, the custody battle, her anger, but said he didn't think she would go that far. Detectives listened carefully, but they'd already started following a new lead, the phone number that had lured Greg out that night. It was a prepaid cell phone, bought anonymously at a Best Buy in Carlsbad. The timestamp on the receipt gave detectives a starting point. They pulled the surveillance footage from the store, scouring hours of grainy video until they froze on a familiar face. It was Diana Lovejoy. When detectives froze that grainy surveillance frame, the image was unmistakable. It was Diana Lovejoy, Greg's ex-wife, calmly standing at the counter of a Best Buy, purchasing the very same prepaid phone that had lured her former husband into the dark. The discovery shifted everything. Diana, the woman who once smiled easily in wedding photos and spent weekends hiking with Greg under the California sun, was now the prime suspect in a calculated ambush. Detectives knew they needed answers, and they needed them fast. They called her in for questioning. Inside the small interview room, Diana appeared composed. Her blonde hair was pulled neatly back, her voice calm and practiced. When asked about the phone, she smiled politely and claimed she'd purchased a router, not a prepaid cell. But the investigators were ready. They placed the still frame from the Best Buy footage on the table and watched her face fall. Diana stared at the image for a long moment before sighing. Finally, she admitted she had bought the phone. But the story she told next would twist and shift with every passing minute. She said she was afraid of Greg, that he'd been harassing her, that the phone was part of a safety plan, not a trap. Then, almost as an afterthought, she mentioned someone new, a man named Weldon McDavid, an ex-Marine and firearms instructor she'd met at a local shooting range. Diana told detectives that she'd taken up shooting lessons for protection. She said Weldon had helped her learn how to use a gun, how to stay safe. Over time, she claimed, they became friends, and then more than friends. To the detectives, it sounded rehearsed, like a story told many times before. Diana insisted that she and Weldon had only planned to scare Greg, that she never intended anyone to get hurt. But when pressed, her version of events began to crumble. She confessed she'd been the one who drove Weldon to the remote site that night. She'd waited nearby, she said, unaware that anything violent was about to happen. And when she heard police sirens later, she panicked. According to Diana, it was then that Weldon told her he had shot Greg in self-defense, that Greg had attacked him. Detectives didn't buy it. Not for a second. Within hours, Diana Lovejoy was under arrest, charged with conspiracy to commit murder and attempted murder. News of her arrest rippled through San Diego. Neighbors were stunned. A few described her as quiet, polite, and devoted to her son. Others whispered that she'd changed after the divorce, that her smiles had become tighter, her words edged with bitterness. But behind those whispers lay the deeper truth. No one really knew what Diana was capable of anymore. While Diana sat in a cell, detectives turned their attention to Weldon McDavid, the man whose name had suddenly surfaced as her alleged accomplice. McDavid was a former Marine with years of weapons training. At the time, he worked as a firearms instructor at Iron Sights, a shooting range not far from Carlsbad. He was charismatic, disciplined, and confident, the kind of man who drew attention without trying. When officers brought him in for questioning, Weldon appeared calm. He denied everything. He said he hadn't been anywhere near Carlsbad that night, that he'd been at home, relaxing. But when detectives asked for a DNA sample, something shifted in his demeanor. His confident tone faltered. His hands fidgeted. He began asking strange questions. Would there be any reason my DNA could be found out there? The detectives exchanged glances. Then they told him something that made the color drain from his face. They had found a pile of feces near the scene of the shooting, evidence suggesting that someone had been hiding there for a long time, unwilling to move. And from that sample, they'd extracted DNA. Weldon paused. Then, as if remembering suddenly, he said something bizarre. He claimed he'd gone for a jog the night before the shooting, after eating Mexican food that had upset his stomach. He said he stopped on a dirt road, needed to relieve himself, and used a towel. Detectives didn't need to say anything. The silence in that room said it all. They had their man. A search warrant was issued for Weldon's home. In the rafters of his garage, police found a rifle loaded with 6 spent shell casings beside it. Those casings matched the number of gunshots Greg's friend Jason had reported hearing. The evidence was stacking up. The prepaid phone, the DNA, the rifle, the connection to Diana. Piece by piece, a picture was forming. One of betrayal, obsession, and premeditation. But it wasn't until detectives went through Diana's computer that the last piece of the puzzle snapped into place. In her search history, they found something chilling. She'd been researching new moon cycles, specifically the date of September 1st, 2016. That night, the night Greg was ambushed, there had been no moonlight at all. Total darkness. Diana had chosen that date on purpose. It was meticulous. It was deliberate. It was murder planned down to the smallest detail. The case against both of them was ironclad. Prosecutors believed that Diana, desperate to escape her divorce debt and regain full custody of her son, had orchestrated the attack. She couldn't afford to pay Greg the $120,000 settlement for the house. She couldn't bear to share her child. So she'd found someone who could solve both problems at once. She'd met Weldon at the range, charmed him, and slowly brought him into her world of fear and anger, convincing him that Greg was dangerous. And together, they'd plotted the ambush. But their plan had failed. Greg survived. And now, the courtroom would become the stage for their downfall. The trial of Diana Lovejoy and Weldon McDavid drew heavy media attention. It was the kind of case that seemed almost cinematic, a suburban mother and a military-trained lover accused of conspiring to execute her husband. Inside the courtroom, the air was tense. Greg sat quietly with his family, his expression unreadable. The bullet that had torn through his chest had missed his vital organs by inches. A miracle, doctors said. When the prosecution began its case, they laid everything bare. The phone records, the DNA, the weapon, the search for a new moon. They argued that the shooting wasn't an accident or self-defense. It was a trap, and Diana was the one who set it. Then came the defense. Weldon's attorneys argued that he never meant to kill Greg. They claimed he'd only intended to scare him, that the gun went off when Greg and his friend shouted that they had a weapon. But prosecutors pointed out the precision of the setup, the location, the lighting, the hidden rifle, and the fact that Greg had been lured there under false pretenses. This wasn't panic. It was a plan. When Diana took the stand, her voice trembled. She painted herself as a victim, a woman cornered by an abusive ex-husband, manipulated by a man she trusted. But the evidence told a different story. The jurors listened as prosecutors read her own text messages, her online searches, her carefully timed movements. Every detail pointed to intention. And then came the moment that no one in that courtroom would ever forget. After days of testimony, the jury filed back into the room. The foreman stood. The clerk began to read. On the charge of conspiracy to commit murder, we find the defendant Diana Lovejoy guilty. On the charge of attempted murder, we find the defendant, Diana Lovejoy, guilty. The words had barely left the clerk's mouth when Diana's eyes rolled back. She gasped, then collapsed to the floor. The courtroom erupted. Paramedics rushed in. Some said she fainted. Others whispered it was an act, a final performance in a tragedy of her own making. Weldon sat motionless, staring at the table before him. Moments later, his own verdict was read. Guilty on all counts. In the end, the sentences were decisive. Weldon McDavid, the man who waited in the dark, armed and ready, received 50 years to life. Diana Lovejoy, the woman who orchestrated it all, was sentenced to 26 years to life. As they were led from the courtroom, both insisted they were innocent. But the evidence, the logic, and the scars on Greg's body told a story no denial could erase. For Greg, survival wasn't just physical. It was emotional. He'd been betrayed by the person he once trusted most, and though justice had been served, the trauma would never fully fade. In interviews years later, Greg said he was grateful to be alive, grateful to raise his son, to move forward. But when asked about forgiveness, he paused, eyes distant. "I don't know if I'll ever understand why," he said quietly. I don't think anyone really can. In the end, the story of Diana Lovejoy isn't just about one woman's descent into darkness. It's about what happens when resentment hardens into rage, when fear becomes obsession, and love turns to something unrecognizable. It's a reminder that evil doesn't always look like the monster in the shadows. Sometimes, it smiles in wedding photos. Sometimes, it lives next door. And sometimes, it's the person who once said they'd love you forever. Thank you for watching. What do you think? Was Diana Lovejoy driven by fear, or by something much darker? Share your thoughts below, and don't forget to like and subscribe for more real-life stories that will keep you thinking long after the video ends.